For the purpose of this examination, the tutorial areas of each game will be considered to be the Undead Asylum for Dark Souls 1, Things Betwixt for Dark Souls 2, and the Cemetery of Ash for Dark Souls 3, including its remade version, the Untended Graves, accessible in the late game. Only the main series Souls games are being examined, although many of these principles can be seen in From Software's other titles. For Dark Souls 2, I will be referring to the Scholar of the First Sin edition. Partially because that's supposedly the definitive edition, but partially because it's the edition I have the easiest access to. Some bits of the tutorial are substantially changed in this version from the original release. In Dark Souls 1, the Undead Asylum, from the point of view of how you will approach it, is pretty linear. Generally speaking, you walk down the first path, climb to the bonfire, have your first encounter with the boss, gain your shield and then your weapon, get your Estus Flask, return to the first bonfire, and then go around to fight the Asylum Demon for real. You don't need the Estus Flask before you fight the demon, but you will need it in order to progress past it, and while you can skip the shortcut back to the bonfire, it's very easy to find and you gain nothing by doing so unless you're trying to save time for a speedrun. So, all in all, with one exception I will discuss later, the tasks you complete are very set in stone. However, the area itself and its looping design as you return to the bonfire adds a slight level of nuance to the area on this first run-through. Dark Souls 2 is considered the oddball of the series for a variety of reasons, but at least one of these is immediately evident. Your character is not actually created until midway through Things Betwixt, and, indeed, some significant challenges can be accessed before you've actually selected your class. Furthermore, Things Betwixt can be almost entirely bypassed. The only stop between your initial spawn and the game's central hub is the character creation screen. Rather, there are several optional paths off the main path that give basic tutorials about certain elements. There are also some rewards along each path. The oddest part of the design, however, is that Scholar of the Sin remade one section of this tutorial, as we shall discuss later, as mid-game level content. However, the tutorial tip for how to interact with environmental objects still remains, locking a piece, albeit one not entirely necessary, behind a mid-game roadblock. Souls 3's tutorial has a very linear structure to it, with the path through being a straight shot past the obstacles you are presented with. However, each stop on that path has a fairly open design, with a few optional items you can pick up on your way and a few paths down which you can travel. In terms of overarching structure, it is less interesting than Dark Souls 1's looping design, but there are more things to find within the level itself, making it perhaps the most interesting out of any of the areas on its first playthrough. The Asylum Demon stands out because it can so very easily be an early roadblock. To an experienced player, its moveset is a very rudimentary set of strikes and area of effect shockwaves, all of which have very noticeable, generous tells. However, to a new player, its high damage and large health pool makes it almost insurmountable until you get your first weapon. When you engage with it, you are intended to run out a side door to claim your starting weapon and shield. However, this is not immediately apparent since the door is rather inconspicuous. This can lead to a frustratingly high number of deaths for a new player. If it is killed here early, it will give a bonus weapon reward. This can be fairly accomplished with black firebombs. The weapon has prohibitively high stat requirements for its point in the game, but can be a fairly interesting reward for experienced players. When you do face him for real, you get a brief tutorial on how plunging attacks work. This takes off a large chunk of his health, and between that and your new weapon, he becomes a far more manageable fight. Dark Souls 2 makes the decision to not include a boss fight in the opening segment of the game. Following the first 30 minutes guideline, this is probably a weak choice, since boss fights are considered such an important part of the gameplay, and a new player won't reach a boss until either they complete the comparatively difficult entry-level area Hyde's Tower of Flame, or the rather extensive Forest of Fallen Giants. Considering this, 3 or 4 hours could easily pass in the new player's game before a boss is even encountered. An odd choice indeed, considering Dark Souls 2 has the highest emphasis on bosses out of any of the games. Eudix Gundyr is surprisingly challenging for a tutorial level boss. Particularly, his second phase is quite hard for a new player to predict. His first phase consists of a fairly straightforward night battle, which, having played the prior two games, I was able to very easily manage on my first playthrough. However, in the second phase, he gains an erratic new moveset, which makes him far more challenging. This, however, is extremely reflective of Dark Souls 3's boss design, considering every boss in the game has multiple distinct phases. Dark Souls 1's tutorial area sets up how, while the game is fairly linear in what it expects of you most of the time, it is continually inventive with how it connects the world together, and might allow experienced players to get different things out of the game by having more subtle routes that are available. Dark Souls 2's tutorial has perhaps the most interesting parallel between the tutorial structure and the game's structure as a whole, and how a large chunk of it can be skipped entirely. One of the odd features in Dark Souls 2 is that, with enough souls, you can bypass several of the initial bosses. It is perhaps not a straight shot through, but you're still opting to just not go down some of the paths presented to you by the game. However, Dark Souls 2's tutorial highlights some of the game's weaknesses as well. The area is a very simple linear branch, lacking the looping, interconnected nature of Dark Souls 1, and the care and detail at each step of the way of Dark Souls 3, and while it has some interesting secrets, the journey to get there is surprisingly bland. Dark Souls 3's tutorial has a lot of care put into each step, but structurally it is the least interesting out of any of the games. If you look at a map of Dark Souls 3's world, you'll find something similar. Each area by itself, just very interesting design, looping back in on itself like the very best of Dark Souls 1 areas, and the very best of Dark Souls 2 areas, too. However, if you look at the progression from area to area throughout the entire world, you'll find that it's a very simple path without much deviation from it. In the same way, the tutorial has a lot of interesting things along the path, but perhaps notably, you don't actually backtrack to the tutorial when you return to it. You find a new area and progress through that area linearly in the same direction you progressed through the original one. Thus, for all the strengths and weaknesses of the different games, From Software does show us something of what we can expect during each tutorial. Since we also learn much of how to play the game in the process, they all succeed in their role as tutorial, but they also have an edge that makes them into something more engaging.